Your Honor, the prosecution calls its next witness, Mrs. Lauren Mercer. The defense attorney's pen dropped onto the table. It hit the wood with a sharp crack that echoed in the silence of Courtroom 7. Because Lauren Mercer was not supposed to be a prosecution witness. Lauren Mercer was the defendant's wife. Lauren Mercer had sat in the front row of that courtroom every single day for the past 2 weeks, dressed in black, dabbing her eyes with a folded tissue, playing the role of a grieving, loyal sister, standing beside her wrongly accused brother, and now she was walking to the witness stand, not to defend him, to destroy him. The man at the defense table, 43-year-old Marcus Hollins, watched his wife cross the courtroom floor. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply watched her, the way a person watches something they always feared would happen finally happening in front of their eyes. Judge Patricia Warren leaned forward. The gallery held its breath. Even the court reporter, a woman who had transcribed thousands of hours of testimony without visible reaction, looked up from her keyboard. Lauren reached the stand. She sat down. She placed her hands flat on the railing in front of her. She looked at the prosecutor. And in a voice that was completely steady, completely clear, and completely devastating, she said, "I want to tell the court what really happened to my husband. Stay right here." Because the story of how Lauren Mercer went from sitting beside her brother to testifying against him is one of the most twisted, calculated, and deeply human stories Sweet Justice has ever covered. And we are just getting started. Subscribe to Sweet Justice right now if you have not already. Hit that button and stay with us. David Mercer was 38 years old when he disappeared on a Thursday evening in April on a stretch of highway outside Raleigh, North Carolina, that he had driven 100 times before. His car was found the following morning, pulled to the shoulder, engine off, keys in the ignition. His phone was on the passenger seat. His wallet was in the center console. David was gone. The initial investigation treated it as a missing persons case. There was no blood, no signs of struggle inside the vehicle, no witnesses. The highway cameras in that stretch had been offline for maintenance for 3 days. A detail that the lead detective, a woman named Sandra Cole, noted in her report. With the particular terseness of someone who found the timing very interesting but could not yet say why. David Mercer had been, by every account, a careful man. He was a structural engineer, methodical by nature, the kind of person who sent his wife a text every time he arrived somewhere safely, who kept a spare phone charger in 3 different locations, who had never once in 11 years of marriage left Lauren without knowing exactly where he was. He had not sent a text that Thursday evening. His last known communication was a call to Lauren at 6:47 telling her he was leaving the office and would be home by 8. She said later that he had sounded completely normal. She said there was nothing in his voice that made her think anything was wrong. He never came home. For the first 6 weeks, Lauren was the picture of a desperate, terrified wife. She gave interviews. She organized search parties. She stood at press conferences with red-rimmed eyes and asked anyone who had seen her husband to come forward. She was articulate, sympathetic, and visibly broken. The community rallied around her. Her brother, 39-year-old Craig Hollins, stood beside her at every public appearance, a steady, protective presence who told reporters that his family would not rest until David was found. Their mother, 64-year-old Diane Hollins, was less visible but equally present, managing logistics behind the scenes, handling the media coordination, keeping Lauren's schedule organized. The family presented a united grieving front. David's body was found 11 weeks after his disappearance, in a shallow grave in a wooded area 40 miles from where his car had been abandoned. He had been stabbed. Multiple times. The weapon had not been recovered. The manner of the wounds indicated that the attack had been close, personal, and prolonged, not the work of a stranger or a robbery. The forensic pathologist who examined the body used a phrase in her report that would later be quoted extensively in the trial. She said the wounds were consistent with someone who wanted to be certain. Detective Sandra Cole's investigation shifted from missing persons to homicide. The same afternoon the body was identified, and the first person she looked at was Lauren Mercer. This is where you need to pay very close attention. Subscribe to Sweet Justice if you are not already subscribed. Because what Sandra Cole found in the first 72 hours of the homicide investigation is the thread that unravels everything. Lauren had a life insurance policy on David. $2 million, taken out 18 months before his death, at Lauren's initiation, with a clause that paid double in the event of violent death. David had been unaware of the double indemnity provision. Lauren had handled the paperwork. She had listed herself as the sole beneficiary and had not told David's parents or his only sibling, a brother named Paul, that the policy existed. That alone was not a crime. People took out life insurance on spouses every day. But Sandra Cole did not stop at the policy. She pulled Lauren's phone records. She pulled Craig's phone records. She pulled their mother, Diane's phone records. And what she found, spread across those 3 sets of records in the 72 hours surrounding David's disappearance, was a pattern of communication that did not match the story the family had told. On the afternoon David disappeared, Lauren had called Craig 4 times. Craig had called Diane twice. Diane had called Lauren once. All of this before David's car was found. All of this before anyone had reported him missing. All of this in a 3-hour window that centered on the exact time David would have been driving home from his office. When Sandra Cole brought Lauren in for a formal interview and asked her to explain the calls, Lauren said they had been about a surprise dinner she was planning for David's upcoming birthday. She said she had been coordinating with Craig and her mother about the guest list and the restaurant. She said it was completely routine. Sandra Cole nodded. She wrote it down. She thanked Lauren for her time, and then she went back to her office, pulled up the cell tower data for those calls, and discovered that Craig Hollins had made 2 of those calls from a tower that placed him within 4 miles of the stretch of highway where David's car was found, at the exact time David's car was found there. Craig Hollins had told investigators he had been at home all evening. He had not been at home. The arrests came on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after David's body was identified. Craig Hollins was taken from his home at 7:15. Diane Hollins was taken from hers 20 minutes later. Lauren was brought in separately without handcuffs and placed in an interview room rather than a holding cell, a distinction that was deliberate and that Craig's attorney would later argue was the first step in a process of manipulation, designed to drive a wedge between Lauren and her family. All 3 were charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and felony murder. The prosecution's theory was straightforward and brutal. David Mercer had been lured out of his routine on the evening of his disappearance, drawn to that stretch of highway by a phone call, a story, something designed to bring him to a specific place at a specific time. Craig had been waiting. The attack had been planned. Lauren had known. Diane had helped coordinate. The $2 million life insurance policy was the motive. Craig's attorney, a veteran defense lawyer named Howard Pierce, immediately began building a narrative around Lauren. He argued that Lauren had planned everything, that Craig and Diane had been manipulated by her, that they were guilty of poor judgment and misplaced family loyalty but not of murder. He filed motions to sever the cases, requesting that Craig and Diane be tried separately from Lauren. The judge denied the motions. They would be tried together. Lauren was appointed a defense attorney named Rachel Sims, who was sharp, experienced, and who spent the first 3 weeks of her representation becoming increasingly convinced that her client was not telling her the full truth. Rachel asked Lauren in their 4th meeting to describe her relationship with David in the 2 years before his death. Lauren said it had been difficult. She said David had become controlling, that he had monitored her spending, that he had become cold and distant with her family. She said she had been unhappy but had not wanted to leave because of the financial consequences. Rachel asked whether Lauren had ever discussed divorce with David. Lauren said no. Rachel asked whether she had discussed it with Craig or Diane. Lauren hesitated, just for a second, but Rachel caught it, and then said no. Rachel filed that hesitation away and kept building the defense. The trial opened on a Monday in February, 8 months after David's body was found. The courtroom was packed every day. David's family, his parents and his brother Paul, sat on the prosecution's side of the gallery. Lauren's side was occupied by friends and neighbors who had known her for years and who, to varying degrees, believed she was being scapegoated by the prosecution for crimes her brother and mother had committed. Do not go anywhere. If you are watching Sweet Justice for the first time, subscribe right now. What happens inside this trial is one of the most shocking mid-case turns we have ever covered on this channel. The prosecution spent the first week laying out its case methodically. The cell tower data placing Craig at the scene. The life insurance policy and its double indemnity clause. Text messages between Craig and Lauren in the month before David's death that the prosecution argued showed planning. Careful, coded. References to timing and location that could be read as innocent coordination but which, in context, painted a different picture. A witness, a former colleague of Craig's named James Tate, who testified that Craig had told him, approximately 4 months before David disappeared, that his sister's husband was a problem that needed solving, and that he was thinking about how to handle it. Craig's attorney cross-examined James Tate aggressively. He suggested the phrase had been taken out of context, that Craig had been referring to a business dispute, not a murder plot. James Tate said he had understood it clearly and that the context had not been business. Howard Pierce asked him how he could be certain. James said, "Because he said it while we were talking about Lauren's insurance policy. He brought it up himself. He knew about the double indemnity." The courtroom went very quiet. Craig Hollins, at the defense table, looked at Howard Pierce. Howard Pierce looked at his notes. He had not known about that detail. His client had not told him. 3 days later, Lauren Mercer walked to the prosecution's witness stand. She had reached a cooperation agreement with the prosecutor's office 2 days earlier, negotiated through Rachel Sims after a conversation that Rachel would describe only as the most difficult of her professional career. The agreement required Lauren to plead guilty to a reduced charge of accessory after the fact, carrying a maximum sentence of 5 years, in exchange for her complete and truthful testimony against Craig and Diane. Lauren had taken it, and now she was here. The prosecutor, a methodical and precise man named Alan Graves, began Lauren's direct examination with a single question. "Mrs. Mercer, did you know in advance that your husband was going to be killed?" Lauren looked at him. She said, "Yes." The sound that moved through the gallery was not quite a gasp. It was something lower, more collective. The sound of a room, full of people absorbing a blow they had half expected and still were not ready for. David's mother, seated in the front row on the prosecution side, pressed both hands over her mouth. Paul Mercer, David's brother, looked at the ceiling. Alan said, "When did you first become aware of the plan?" Lauren said, "About 5 months. Before it happened. Craig came to me. He said David was going to destroy our family financially. He said David had found out about money that Craig owed, a large amount from a business deal that had gone wrong, and that David was going to expose it and pursue legal action that would ruin Craig and take everything from our mother. He said the only way to protect the family was to make sure David couldn't follow through." Alan said, "And what did you say when your brother told you this?" Lauren was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I said I needed time to think. And Craig said there wasn't much time, and I didn't say no." Alan walked her through the planning over the following 40 minutes. The selection of the highway, the cover story that had brought David to that stretch of road, a phone call from Lauren telling him there had been an accident involving her mother, asking him to take a specific route to meet her, a story constructed specifically to pull him away from his normal path home. The signal Lauren had sent Craig by text when David left the office, the $2 million policy, and who had known about the double indemnity from the beginning. Craig Hollins had known. He had suggested the policy. He had researched the clause. He had told Lauren exactly how to fill out the application and exactly what not to say to David about it. Diane had known. She had provided the alibi for Craig that evening, telling investigators he had been at her house for dinner, a statement she had maintained through 6 weeks of investigation and 2 formal police interviews. Lauren said that in the days after David's disappearance, she had understood for the first time, fully and without the comfortable distance of abstraction, what she had agreed to. She said she had stopped sleeping. She said she had started keeping a record, dates, conversations, specific things Craig and Diane had said to her in the planning months, written on paper she kept hidden in the lining of a winter coat. In the back of her closet, Alan Graves said, "Why did you keep that record?" Lauren said, "Because I knew somewhere that I was going to need it one day. I didn't know if that day would come, but I kept it anyway." That record, 17 pages of handwritten notes, recovered from Lauren's coat lining by investigators, after the cooperation agreement was signed, was entered into evidence as Prosecution Exhibit 31. It corroborated every element of Lauren's testimony with dates and details that she could not have fabricated after the fact. Craig's name appeared 41 times. Diane's name appeared 23 times. Specific conversations were recorded with timestamps that matched phone records already in evidence. Subscribe to Sweet Justice right now if you are still watching, because Howard Pierce's cross-examination of Lauren is the moment this trial becomes something else entirely. Howard Pierce stood up for cross-examination with the controlled energy of a man who has been waiting for this moment and has prepared for it more thoroughly than he has prepared for anything in his career. He was not going to be able to break Lauren's account. The physical evidence was too strong, the documentation too specific. What he was going to do was something more surgical. He was going to make the jury question why they should believe a single word from a woman who had just admitted, on the witness stand of a murder trial, that she had helped plan her own husband's death. He said, "Mrs. Mercer, you loved your husband?" Lauren said, "Yes." Howard said, "And yet you sent your brother a text message telling him David had left the office. You knew what that text was for." Lauren said, "Yes." Howard said, "You made a phone call to your husband telling him to take a different route home. You knew what that call was for." Lauren said, "Yes." Howard said, "You took out a $2 million insurance policy on him with a double indemnity clause for violent death. You knew what that policy was for." Lauren said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Yes." Howard let that sit. He looked at the jury. Then he said, "Mrs. Mercer, you are not here today because you had a change of heart. You are here today because you made a deal. Isn't that correct?" Lauren said, "I am here because my husband is dead and the people who planned it need to answer for it." Howard said, "Including you?" Lauren said, "I already am." It was not the answer Howard had wanted. He moved on, but the jury had heard it, and several of them wrote something in their notebooks at that exact moment. Diane Hollins took the stand in her own defense 2 days later. She was composed, well-dressed, and entirely unconvincing. She said Lauren had fabricated the notes. She said Lauren had manipulated Craig from the beginning. She said she had given Craig an alibi that evening because she genuinely believed he had been at her house and that her memory of that night had simply been confused by the stress of David's disappearance. She said her daughter had always been capable of extraordinary deception. The prosecutor's cross-examination of Diane lasted 3 hours. Alan Graves went through the phone records, the cell tower data, the 17 pages of notes, and the testimony of James Tate point by point. He asked Diane for each piece of evidence to explain how Lauren could have fabricated or manipulated it. Diane's answers became progressively less coherent as the afternoon wore on. By the time Alan reached the cell tower data placing Craig at the scene, Diane had stopped offering explanations and was simply saying she did not know. Alan said, "You don't know how your son's cell phone placed him 4 miles from where your son-in-law's car was found at the exact time your son-in-law disappeared?" Diane said, "I don't know anything about cell phones." Alan said, "No further questions." Craig Hollins did not testify. Howard Pierce made the decision, communicated to the court the evening before Craig was scheduled to take the stand, that Craig would exercise his Fifth Amendment right. It was the right strategic call, but the jury had now watched Craig sit silently through 3 weeks of testimony that placed him at a murder scene, named him as the architect of a conspiracy, and described him in his own sister's words as the man who had proposed killing her husband as a solution to a financial problem. His silence had a weight to it that no instruction from the judge could fully neutralize. Closing arguments came on a Thursday. Alan Graves spoke for 50 minutes. He was spare and precise. He walked the jury through the evidence in the order it had been presented: the insurance policy, the cell tower data, the text message, the phone call to David, the 17 pages of notes, James Tate's testimony, and finally Lauren's own words on the witness stand. He said the defense had spent 3 weeks trying to make this case about Lauren, about her credibility, about the deal she had made. He said the deal was real, and the jury should weigh it appropriately, but he said the deal did not create the cell tower data. The deal did not create the insurance policy. The deal did not put Craig's cell phone 4 miles from that highway. He said, "The evidence does not need Lauren Mercer to be a good person. It just needs to be true, and it is." Howard Pierce's closing was 90 minutes and technically brilliant. A sustained argument about reasonable doubt, the unreliability of cooperating witnesses, and the fundamental unfairness of convicting a man primarily on the testimony of the person most responsible for the crime. He was persuasive. He was thorough. He gave the jury every possible reason to hesitate, but he could not explain the cell tower. He had tried in earlier testimony, and the explanation had not landed. The jury had seen him try and fail, and they remembered it. The jury deliberated for 14 hours across 2 days. They sent out 2 questions. The first asked for the cell tower evidence to be explained again in writing. The second asked whether the cooperation agreement Lauren had signed required her to tell the truth or simply to testify. Judge Warren's response to the second question was careful and complete. She explained that cooperation agreements required truthful testimony, that if Lauren had lied, the agreement would be void, and she would face the full original charges. She explained that the jury could weigh that fact in any way they found appropriate. The jury returned to deliberations. 8 hours later, they had a verdict. Craig Hollins stood as the foreperson. A retired accountant named Gerald Ross unfolded the verdict form. Craig's hands were at his sides, his jaw was set. He had the look of a man who has run every calculation and still cannot be certain of the outcome. Gerald Ross read in a steady voice, "On the charge of first-degree murder, we the jury find the defendant, Craig Hollins, guilty." Craig closed his eyes. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty." Howard Pierce wrote something on his legal pad without looking up. Diane Hollins received the same verdict on both counts 40 seconds later. She made a sound, a single, sharp sound, quickly suppressed, and then went still. Judge Warren sentenced Craig Hollins to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Diane Hollins received 35 years. Both sentences were delivered in the same measured, unflinching tone that Judge Warren used for everything. The tone of someone who understood that the weight of what she was saying did not require theatrics to be felt. Lauren Mercer was sentenced separately, 3 weeks later, under the terms of her cooperation agreement. She received 4 years and 8 months. She served 3 years and 2 months before being released on good behavior. David Mercer's brother Paul gave a statement outside the courthouse after the sentencing. He stood at the microphone for a long moment before he spoke. Then he said, "David was the most decent person I have ever known. He trusted the people around him. He deserved better than what they did to him. I hope they spend every day of the rest of their lives understanding that." He stepped back from the microphone. He did not take questions. The $2 million insurance policy was never paid out. The insurer contested the claim on the grounds that Lauren, as a convicted accessory, was legally prohibited from benefiting from the proceeds of the crime she had participated in. The money was held in escrow pending a civil suit filed by David's parents, who argued that the policy proceeds should flow to his estate. That case was settled 2 years after the criminal verdict, with the funds distributed to a foundation established in David's name supporting engineering scholarships at his alma mater. It was, in the end, the only thing that came from that policy that David Mercer himself might have recognized. This is what sweet justice looks like when the people closest to you are the most dangerous, when a drive home becomes a trap. When the person sitting beside you in a courtroom is not who you think they are, and when the truth, however late, however painful, however complicated, finally stands up and says what it needs to say. Thank you for watching. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself unable to look away, then you already know why sweet justice exists. Subscribe to our channel. Share this video with someone who loves a story that does not go where you expect. Hit that bell so you never miss what comes next. We will see you very soon.